So the purpose of this video is to discuss the benefits, do a benefit analysis on whether, how and you should remove your engine from your gearbox. So traditionally, if you had to do a clutch, so here's the engine out of the 172, there's the clutch. So traditionally your clutch fails, it's got old, you've got to do it. So what, in most Clios, what they say to do is drop this K-frame on this side, the lower K-frame, leave it attached, and then you can get it out. The problem with that instruction is the fact that most Clios don't have a power steering unit, right? So when you're running a 2 litre, you've got the hydraulic power steering, not the E-Pass, and not the manual rack. So it's a different rack. You've got the bigger exhaust system, you've got heat shrouds, all located down there. So when someone says to you, oh, you need to do your clutch on your Clio, traditionally they don't have all that. So all you do is you just undo your K-frame, you drop it down a bit, and bang, you pull your clutch out. Now you've still got to take out your drive shafts, obviously. Some people say, oh, you can do it without taking it. Okay, well, if you want to leave that drive shaft in, that's your business, but take it out, at least get it out of the way. Pull the gearbox out, okay? But then you've got all this. So when you go to do it on a 172, I'll tell you, and I've done this on 172s, and it's painful. You have to get out, let's touch this in so I get it in. This rack is held in differently to the racks on the manual rack with the E-Pass and non-E-Pass versions. This is a hydraulic rack and it's held with different holders. You have different sway bar assembly setup. You have this line and you have this heat shield. And all of this stuff combined makes the job of just taking out a clutch in the car very, very painful. You'll find a YouTube video of people just absolutely cringing that they tried to remove their gearbox and do their clutch or repair their gearbox without lifting the engine out, leaving the engine in. And I've done it, but I'm telling you, it is a painful, painful job. You spend more time underneath. Okay, so what I've done here, and you can't see, I've already taken the gearbox off, is I've had the luxury of an engine crane. And then I've purchased this load adjusting tool, okay? So if you wanted to do it this way, you could easily go to your hire shop, hire a simpler crane, and hire this load adjusting tool. Now this is where it's really good. With that load adjusting tool, you can actually remove the entire motor with AC, alternator, water pump, tensioner, all still in place. Timing, everything's in place. Now when we did this, just to take you through the process, lifted off the intake manifold to get it out of the way. Okay, that's a few bolts. Then at the breech to that gives you access to reach around the back of the motor, undo all the bolts that hold the exhaust manifold on, which is there. Now that's just dangling. But what you will need to do is get under and undo the flange further back so that it can go backwards out of the way. What you don't have to do is touch those bolts that are located on the pivot point. Now this is a 172 manifold. You can get to them, but geez, they're painful. So what you've done is you've accessed the bolts up the top. When you go to lift the motor out, you have to lift this up out of the way, and that's why you have to undo it to get it backwards. Now, the other lines, obviously your traditional lines have to come out of the way. Your hydraulic line, you disconnect the two fittings. There's one of them, that's the high pressure line. You disconnect the high pressure fitting and its colleague, the low pressure line at the pump. You then drain that oil down into a receptacle. You then remove over here with one clip, undo the line and drain out the rest of it, so you get rid of all of your hydraulic fluid out of your system. It's still in down there in the rack, it hasn't completely gone. So that's the high pressure supply to the rack, that's the low pressure return to the reservoir, and then there's a low pressure supply to the pump. So it's all gravity fed, okay? But what you've got to do is, this is strapped to your gearbox anyway, so you have to get that off your gearbox to get it up. So you're going to be touching that stuff, you're going to be working over in there. So there'll be someone out there who say, well, that's a hell of a lot of work just to change a clutch, and I completely agree, it is a hell of a lot of work, but there's equally a hell of a lot of work to be done down there. So I've not touched any of my suspension except to remove the top two. All you do is remove the top two bolts in your strut upright so that you can get your drive shaft out and your tyre on. So you haven't affected the wheel line, but you haven't lowered the K-frame. You haven't undone these bolts there, those bolts there. You haven't undone any of the bolts, nuts, washers, assembly that hold the rack in, that hold the steering column in. You've unaffected all of that, but what you have done is you've pulled the engine and the gearbox out. Now, the one other thing, the hydraulic line's pretty straightforward. You can disconnect that, reconnect it, fill it up with fresh fluid. You're giving your system a fluid flush. You've had to pull out the radiator, so you're giving your cooling system a flush. You've checked all your fittings and your pipes. You've done some good checkovers. Now remember, these cars are now 20 years old. Where people don't like it and people complain, and I understand, this is your air conditioning. So this is an air conditioning model. Most of them you'll own are air conditioning models. The problem with the air conditioning is you've got to get that out of the way. Now, the only people the air conditioning model will be an issue for is those with a good working air conditioning that they've just had it serviced. So this isn't, where I see it, is this is an opportunity to degas. If you've got a good system, it's going to be an extra layer of challenge. If your system's already degassed because it's evaporated into the atmosphere because your seal's gone, then it's not going to be too hard. And at the same time you're removing everything, you'll be able to do all of your important seals in your AC unit and reassemble it, and hopefully take it to your local gas guy, get it pressure tested, vac tested, and regassed and checked. And so you're basically able to do it. Now in this case, I'm going to probably do a condenser at the front and a receiver dryer and then reinstall it. So the argument against this is, well, I've got to take it to a shop and get my aircon degassed first. Other than that, you don't need to do it. The other argument against this method is, oh, I need to lift the car up, I have to have the car and have to have a crane, I have to pull my front bumper off, I have to do all this other stuff. And look, okay, if you don't want to do it and you want to fight on the ground doing all of that and lowering it and then reassembling it, lying on the dirt, be my guest. If you say, well, I'll do it on a hoist, I'll say, okay. But you need to support this motor. Remember that once you've got it down and loosened, you have to support it. So you'll need to do a frame across there to support this engine. So other guys will say, no, I don't do it that way. What I do is I just undo the 4 bolts and I lower the whole thing down. And I'm like, well, yes, okay, that's one way of doing it, and I've seen it done, and I don't have anything against it. I've done it myself on other model cars. But when you lower everything at one maneuver, you still got to disconnect your speedo, the drive on your what's it called? The end of the steering column has to be disconnected. So that's one fiddly little nightmare job. You aren't going to be able to take your air conditioning with you, so it's still going to have to be disconnected. Okay, when it all drops down, you're still going to have radiators dropping down, you know, things, but then you've got on the ground, you've got everything laying there. So there's a different procedure for every particular job, but the benefit of doing this is I now can access my timing belt, and I can do my accessory belt, timing belt. I can check my tensioners, my guides, everything's there. I'm going to chip off on that one. So there's a bunch of stuff that can be done much easier than if it's in the car. So if you were lining up to do, in this example, we're doing timing belt, alternator belt, checking all the pulleys, and you can get a good check on them. We're doing the gearbox, we're resealing the gearbox, doing the bottom of the selector fork seal, and then we're going to reinstall it all, and the aircon was clapped out anyway, so we've got to fix that up. Look for a couple of noises. I'm probably going to lift this timing cover off, and then the receiver dryer had to be changed, flush the radiator. The radiator's got a hole in it, so I'm probably going to do something with the radiator at the same time I'm in there, put it all back together. So guys, you know, if this car was only 5 years old and you're doing your first clutch in it, you know, and everything was fairly clean and new, you might say, well, I'll just run with it, drop it, because I can do it on a 4-poster or a 2-poster. But if you've got the space you're going to do a couple of jobs on your 172. It's a bit old, it's a bit tired, it's 20 years old, and you want to save yourself a mountain of absolute grief for no achievement, because nobody needs to touch the rack. You don't need to drop the rack out. Look at that. I've even left the dog bone mount sitting there. The exhaust is still in place. I can then service those components on the exhaust while it's like this without a whole big job. Lower control arms are all still in place. Struts are still in place. Everything's out of your way. You don't need to try and pull out your gearbox, because that's your problem. People realise is you have to get a gearbox between a hole where that was and that is. So you need to lang it down. You need to pull it out. You need to have all this stuff out of your way in order to do the job. You know, even your strut there can be a pain in the backside. So you got to drop the strut out of the way. You got to drop the brake lines out of the way. So I've not disturbed any of the brake lines in this job. I've not disturbed the K-frame or the power steering unit to do this removal of this gearbox and this engine. The only disturbance is I've undisconnected my hydraulic lines, made a little bit of a mess, and I've had to disconnect the air conditioning unit, and obviously I've sealed that up, and when I put it all back together, it'll go back together with new seals. I've got good access to all of my components on my motor, and I've got the ability to do an accurate, complete repairs on any of my timing belts at the front. So consider this an option. Don't consider it the way to do it, but consider when you're considering you've got to do some work on your Clio, and you know that some of it's going to involve the gearbox or the clutch, and you're going to incorporate a timing belt change at the same time, remembering timing belts should be done every 4 years according to the manufacturer, which means if you've made it to 5 years, it's well and truly due.